In the final months of his life, Steve Jobs wasn't focused on the iPhone, he was looking far beyond. Despite his failing health, he whispered ideas that would shape Apple's next decade. A car, a smarter TV, even a reinvention of healthcare. He knew time was running out, but his mind wouldn't slow down. This isn't just about tech, it's about a man chasing eternity with code and vision. Buried in Apple's archives was a blueprint, not for a phone, but for a car. Jobs believed the car industry was ripe for disruption. He envisioned an autonomous, elegant machine, as simple as an iPod. Though he'd never see it built, he met with designers, engineers, planting the seed. Years later, whispers of Project Titan would echo his original sketches, the Steve Jobs legacy driving on. Television frustrated Steve, he once called it broken. He dreamed of a seamless TV experience, no remotes, no inputs, just elegance. In his final days, he told biographer Walter Isaacson, "I finally cracked it." But what did he mean? To this day, Apple insiders debate that moment. Some say it was the blueprint for Apple TV Plus, others believe it was a forgotten OS. The truth remains partially coded. As his body weakened, Jobs became obsessed with healthcare, not for profit, but survival. He saw how broken the system was, endless forms, disconnected data. He imagined an Apple-like approach, seamless, human, digital. He even met with doctors and designers, envisioning a platform where patients own their records. Though he wouldn't live to build it, his vision now pulses inside every Apple Watch. October 2011, frail but defiant, Steve Jobs appeared one last time in public. It wasn't at an Apple event, but a city council meeting. He pitched a spaceship-shaped campus, saying it would breathe creativity. This wasn't about real estate, it was a cathedral for invention. Jobs wasn't designing a building, he was designing a future. A home for dreamers he knew would outlive him. For Steve, one more thing wasn't just a catchphrase. It was a philosophy that the best was always ahead. Even as cancer claimed his body, his mind kept building. He left behind notes, sketches, dreams, unfinished but burning with purpose. And those who worked with him say, he knew Apple would outlive him, but he wanted its soul to remain his. Few know that Jobs pushed for simplicity not just in design, but in code. He often said it works when it disappears. His influence wasn't just aesthetic, it's in every swipe, every boot-up chime. Apple's software today still follows principles he obsessed over: clarity, empathy, restraint. In the DNA of every product lives a man who believed tech should feel human, not mechanical. Inside Apple Park, there's a quiet hallway, no fanfare, no signs. Just a large black and white photo of Steve, watching, listening. New hires pass it every day, some pause, some whisper thank you. It's more than a tribute, it's a reminder that Apple isn't just code and glass. It's the echo of a man who asked different questions and never stopped until the answers changed the world. Look closely at any Apple device and you'll find traces of Steve Jobs. Not in logos or memorials, but in the invisible choices. Rounded corners, a single button, silence where others add noise. These weren't trends, they were philosophies. Engineers still ask, what would Steve do? Because even though he's gone, his fingerprints are everywhere. Haunting the edges of the glass and whispering in the simplicity. Steve Jobs never cared just about the device, he cared about the feeling it gave you. He asked how it would make people feel, not just how it would work. That's why his legacy isn't a product, it's an emotion. Wonder, delight, control. Apple today still chases that magic. And whether you love or hate their ecosystem, you're feeling what Steve designed, an experience you can't quite explain. When Steve Jobs passed on October 5, 2011, the tech world fell quiet. Rival CEOs paused, fans lit candles outside Apple stores. But inside Apple, something else happened. There was no panic, no chaos, just quiet resolve. Because Jobs had prepared them, not just with plans, but with principles. He didn't build a company that needed him. He built a company that remembered him in every decision. Jobs didn't leave behind a manual, he left something harder: vision. A relentless demand for elegance, a refusal to compromise, and a belief that technology should serve the soul. His teams inherited that fire. When they released the Apple Watch, AirPods, and M1 chip, they weren't just new products. They were silent nods to a ghost. A founder still whispering, "Make it insanely great." Was Steve Jobs a genius or just obsessed? A visionary or a tyrant? Those who knew him say he was all of it. He demanded the impossible because he saw what others didn't. And though Apple has changed, the arguments around him haven't. But one truth remains: he made people feel something. Love, frustration, wonder. And in a world full of noise, that kind of impact doesn't die. Even in his last days, Steve Jobs talked about what could be. A true Apple car, quiet, self-driving, elegant. A healthcare system with dignity and data in harmony. He imagined education reimagined through the iPad. And devices that didn't just respond, they understood. Some of these ideas live on, others still wait in silence. But they all share one thing: a belief that technology at its best is poetry in motion. Steve Jobs isn't just a name in history books, he's a question. What if one person demanded more? What if beauty mattered in a world obsessed with speed? What if simplicity wasn't a limitation, but a destination? He left no easy answers. But his question still echoes in every keynote, every prototype. And for those who build the future, he's still asking, is this insanely great? Every few years, when Apple launches something bold, people still ask, would Steve have approved? And maybe that's the point. He's become the conscience of innovation. Not to preserve the past, but to push it forward with soul. So when a screen folds or a chip rewrites the rules, it's not just progress. It's a whisper from a man who once said, "Stay hungry, stay foolish." At Apple, legacy doesn't sit in a museum, it moves in real time. Every product pitch, every prototype review, someone invokes Steve. Not as a relic, but as a lens. What would he question? What would he simplify? He's no longer the driver, but the compass. And in that way, Steve Jobs didn't just build devices. He built a blueprint for how to think. You won't see his name on new product boxes. There are no Steve Jobs editions, no annual tributes. And yet he's everywhere. In the silence between taps. In the elegance of things that just work. That's his greatest design: influence without presence. Because true vision doesn't demand attention. It reshapes the world quietly until we can't remember how it was before. In one of his last keynote decks, there was a single closing slide. No product name, no bullet points. Just 3 words: the journey continues. It wasn't about devices, it was a farewell and a promise. That vision doesn't end with death, it evolves. And as long as people ask why and dare to imagine what if, Steve Jobs is still here, not in person, but in pursuit. Every chip Apple makes now, M1, M2, and beyond, carries more than speed. It carries a philosophy. Custom, elegant, efficient, built not for the market, but for the mission. Jobs once said, people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world, do. And that madness lives on, not just in processors or patents, but in a belief that technology should serve imagination, not control it. For Steve Jobs, the screen was never the end, it was a window. To creativity, to emotion, to something deeper. He believed great technology disappears, so what remains is the failing. Wonder, clarity, power. That belief still shapes how Apple thinks, builds, and dares. Because in every swipe, tap, and pause, you're not just using a device. You're staring into the soul of a man who refused to build ordinary things. Apple Park wasn't just a headquarters, it was Steve's last masterpiece. He called it the best office building in the world. Every curve, every tree, every pane of glass was intentional. Not to impress, but to inspire. A place where nature and invention breathed the same air. It's not a monument to the past. It's a workshop for the future, built by a man who knew beauty could fuel breakthroughs. As a child, Steve stared at the night sky and dreamed, not of gadgets, but of possibility. He once said, "We're here to put a dent in the universe." To him, that wasn't metaphor. It was a mission. Every product, every keynote, every impossible idea was aimed at something bigger. And maybe that's the point. He didn't just chase innovation. He chased infinity. Steve Jobs was never just a CEO. He was part inventor, part artist, and all conviction. He believed in hard edges, soft finishes, and sharp questions. To him, technology wasn't neutral, it was moral. It could uplift or numb. That's why his influence still matters. Because he didn't build for attention. He built for meaning. And meaning, once planted, grows long after the hands that shaped it are gone. His voice still echoes, not just in recordings, but in decisions. When a product is delayed because it's not perfect. When a feature is removed because it's not essential. That's Steve. He may be gone, but inside Apple, he's not silent. In meetings, in prototypes, in principles, he still argues. Because the voice of vision isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a whisper no one dares ignore. Greatness for Steve Jobs came with a price. He pushed people hard, sometimes too hard. He sacrificed comfort for clarity, friendship for focus. But he also pulled brilliance from those around him. Apple wasn't built on kindness, it was built on obsession. And maybe that's what it took. Not to be liked, not even to be understood. But to leave behind something that would outlive him. Steve Jobs' final keynote wasn't a launch, it was a goodbye. No product, no one more thing. Just a vision, Apple Park. He stood there thinner than ever, but eyes still burning. Explaining curves, trees, and space like they were circuitry. It wasn't about the building, it was about what would be born inside it. A final performance. Not to showcase innovation, but to make sure it would never stop. Steve Jobs didn't just pass on designs or deadlines, he passed on belief. That art and engineering aren't rivals, but soulmates. That good is never good enough. That technology, when done right, becomes invisible and unforgettable. His teams still carry that torch. And though their hands build the future, his fingerprints remain on the blueprints. Because what he really left behind was not a company, but a way of thinking. What would Steve Jobs build today? An AI that feels or a world that listens? A screen you wear or one you no longer need? No one knows. But the better question might be, what would he question? Because Steve didn't chase answers, he chased friction. Discomfort, change. And in that restless pursuit, he left us not just tools, but a challenge: don't settle. Ideas usually fade. They're replaced, forgotten, or buried by time. But Steve Jobs' ideas didn't just survive, they evolved. They slipped into our hands, our homes, even our hearts. They reshaped how we talk, how we learn, how we dream. Not because they were loud, but because they were right. That's what legacy looks like. Not a statue, not a slogan. Just a world quietly built around one man's vision. Without Steve Jobs, there would be no Apple as we know it. But more than that, there might be no digital life as we live it. He didn't just launch products, he launched paradigms. Touchscreens, app stores, wireless simplicity. He helped shape a future where technology feels like magic. And though he never saw this world fully form, it still speaks in his language and moves with his ambition. Steve Jobs didn't live to see the world he imagined. But maybe that was never the point. Because visionaries don't just chase the future. They ignite it in others. And now every dreamer who dares to think different carries a spark of him forward. So if you're watching this on a glowing screen, remember the man behind it once believed you could change the world just by holding an idea. Steve's story doesn't end here because legacy only lives if it's passed on. So if something in you stirred, if a question lit up, don't ignore it. Build, break, imagine, and let his vision challenge yours. Subscribe for more stories behind the minds that shaped our world. Because the future isn't built by algorithms. It's built by people brave enough to ask, what's next?